what it's called when we don't have regular menstrual cycles is amenorrhea, hypothalamic amenorrhea. And how that occurs is it usually occurs as a combination of psychological and or physical stress and low energy availability. So low energy availability it's basically our energy availability is the amount of energy we have left after our activity levels, our training for bodily functions and reproductive function. And when we have limited any energy available after our expenditure through our activity, through our training, etc., what our body will do is it will sacrifice our menstrual cycle function in order to keep our other bodily functions going and keep us alive. But with that sacrifice of our menstrual cycle function and impaired hormone health comes other consequences. And what will usually accompany the absence of menstrual cycle function is low estrogen. So if we think about the symptoms that women experience when they're going through the menopause, a lot of those are replicated with women who have amenorrhea.
Thank you so much, Danni. It's so great to have you on this show. I've been really looking forward to this conversation. This is, I don't know if you know, but this is part of the, I call it the Build a Killer Body series on my podcast, where, do you know what, I'm just digging into fitness and, you know, how to look your best and how to build a physique that you're proud of and, you know, to be strong and healthy. And I really miss that side of my life because I used to be a fitness professional, but now I'm in nutrition. So I'm very much about food and, you know, about hormonal health, perimenopause and fertility and things like that. But I just wanted to do a series on fitness. And I think you're so, so perfect for this because you're clearly on top of your game when it comes to this industry. I mean, you've been doing it for so long, haven't you? And also you've competed, I think, on stage. Like, so what's your story with the competitions and the physique? Like, I don't have the right term for it, but yeah. Have you competed in the past? What was that like?
Yeah, I have done. So essentially, I come from, like, I've always been really into sport from a very young age. In my teens, I played football, so that was my main sport, and then did like everything else I could basically throw myself into through school. And then because I was always heavily into fitness, nutrition, training, that side of things, I did my PT course in 2015 and went straight into working as a personal trainer on the gym floor. I started at a pure gym, and during that time, I was instructing classes, so things like legs, bums and tums, spin, body pump, all of that sort of thing. And I was also one-to-one personal training. And then after doing that for about 4 years, I moved online. So I'm now fully working online as a sort of health and fitness professional. And I also have my own podcast as well. And after a year or so of working on the gym floor at Pure Gym, I got into bodybuilding. So basically, I had started to resistance train, my physique started to develop, and one of the other personal trainers said to me, have you ever thought about bodybuilding? And at the time, I did follow a lot of bodybuilders, female bodybuilders on like YouTube. YouTube was very big at the time. It was like Nikki Blackter, Emily Hayden, like the really sort of, they don't compete anymore, but at the time they were really popular female bikini athletes. And I'd always followed them on YouTube, but I never really thought that it would be something I would be able to do personally. So when someone suggested it to me, I was kind of like, oh, well, I am a fan of bodybuilding, but it's never something I thought of myself doing. And because I come from that sporting background, I am quite competitive, and it just seemed like another challenge for me. And it was also an opportunity for me to learn from another coach as well. So he put me in touch with his coach, who was a very knowledgeable strength and conditioning coach who was local to me at the time. And he was also a lecturer at university as well. So I worked with that coach, basically started a prep straight away and got into bodybuilding. Whilst I was working with that coach, I actually learned a lot. And it was a great process for me to go through initially as a coach myself, because like I said, he was a lecturer at university, he was a strength and conditioning coach, a very knowledgeable person to work with. So it taught me so much. And I first stepped on stage then in 2016. I started competing with the UKBFF, which were sort of the federation to go to back in the day, and then moved over to competing with the PCA and IFBB. And the further into my competitive career I got, the more extreme the sport got, and the more I had to sacrifice in order to get into stage condition and to improve the version of me I was bringing to the stage. And it got to the point in 2020 where it was consuming a lot of my life, and it was taking a lot from me in terms of my health, in terms of my social life. My entire life essentially was dedicated to the sport of bodybuilding. And I kind of got to the point where I was like, what am I doing this for? And I realized that it wasn't really in line with my values anymore. I really valued my health, but I was sacrificing that for the sport. And yeah, I just felt like it was taking way more from me than it was offering. So I then moved away from competing myself, and I also eventually moved away from coaching competitors, because I used to coach bodybuilding competitors as well as lifestyle clients. But as I sort of moved away from competing myself, I realized I was like, I really value my health and I value my clients' health. I really care about each individual that I work with really deeply. But I was pushing them through this process, which ultimately would have a negative impact on their health in some way. And that didn't sit right with me anymore. So I decided to stop coaching competitors from there, and obviously moved away from competing myself. And I now actually help people out of the other side of bodybuilding. So I help people move into sort of normal life after bodybuilding. I help people recover from a health perspective, improve their body image and relationship with food, and progress towards their goals whilst actually improving their health and quality of life, as opposed to sacrificing it for the sport.
Right, because that's where you are really at the moment. So you're kind of maintaining where you were after competition, and you're just creating a lifestyle, just maintaining what you had as much as possible, obviously without the health implications. But I think that's a really amazing story, because the thought that you went into fitness in 2015 and then you're on stage a year later, that is absolutely insane, like how quickly that happened for you. Did you feel, how did you feel going into that? Did you feel like it was too fast, or did you feel like you were ready for it? Like 1 year later, you're like, boom, like I can get on the stage. Like, how was that for you back then?
Yeah, well, like I said, I got into personal training when I was in 2015, but I had already been training for a good few
I
years.
see, yeah.
It wasn't like I hadn't just started training and then
Right,
started a
yes.
contract. It was more that like I'd been training for a few years, and then started to see, my physique change, and then decided, like to give it a shot. And at the time, there was no pressure on me, it was just a case that I was doing it to challenge myself. I was doing it as a learning experience, to learn from the coach that I was working with. I had no expectations in terms of placings. I wasn't chasing my pro card. I wasn't trying to compete with a certain federation. I was literally just like, let's do this. It's another challenge. Let's see what I can do. I'll see if I enjoy the process, and then we can go from there. So there was no pressure. It was just, so it was more of I had a much healthier relationship with bodybuilding when I first started it, because it didn't consume my life. It was more just something to challenge myself with, and a process that would teach me a lot. So I definitely don't regret getting into it, and my relationship with it was a lot healthier to begin with. But then the further into the sport I got, the more consuming it got, the more I had to give to it. And that's where it did become all consuming, and I saw more negatives than positives towards the end.
And why do you think that is? Why do you think you started to feel more pressure? Is it because the stakes were getting higher and you were expecting to place this time, and like you were just applying the pressure yourself, or where was it coming from? Why do you think that was happening?
Yeah, so I think obviously I did my first show, like I said, no expectations. And then I competed again the next season, and that next season I saw huge improvements from a physique perspective. and I placed first in my category at that like next show, and then second in my height class with women who were a lot older than I was. So I then saw my potential within bodybuilding. I saw that, you know, if I wanted to, I could probably take this quite far and do pretty well at it. Yeah. So that was where the pressure came. And with that as well, my social media following was growing a little bit on Instagram. People expected more, especially if you were sharing your journey on there, which I was. And I also ended up getting into a relationship with a bodybuilder. So it became very much my entire life. And there was pressure coming from pretty much every angle, coming from myself, coming from my peers, coming from, you know, my partner at the time, coming from even other coaches wanted me to do quite well to some extent. So it was kind of coming from all angles, to be honest. But you've got to question, okay, I'm chasing this goal. Say you're chasing your pro card, you've got to question, okay, like, what is that actually offering you? What are you doing it for? Are you just doing it because it seems like the done thing? Are you just doing it because everyone's egging you on and pushing you to do that? Or is it really making you happy?
And so for you, I presume it was the latter. You were doing it because you were in the momentum, like you're in this wave, and you're just like, well, I better go with it, and you were just kind of going with it. I suppose that was your stance.
Multiple reasons, really. Like I said, at first I was definitely doing it for the right reasons. Like at first I was doing it for myself, but then the further I got into it, the more it just became my life, and it just became what I did. And until you take a step back and question that, you'll continue to do it without giving it really a second thought. And then towards the end, so my last season, I was going through quite a bad breakup at the time, and I definitely used competing as a coping mechanism, which is something that I see a lot of people doing. They'll be going through difficult periods of their life. It could be, you know, a breakup, it could be loss, it could be that they're going through grief, or they might be dealing with issues from a relationship with food or a body image perspective. And then what they'll do is they'll dive into competing, and they'll use that as a coping mechanism because it is all consuming, and they'll shut everything else out. It gives them a false sense of progression, and it means that they don't have to deal with all of that other stuff because they've got this huge distraction. But the problem with that is it means that those problems don't go away, they get worse. And then when they come away from bodybuilding, when the prep ends, they've got all of this crap to deal with, basically.
It's so good that you mentioned that, because I think that, you know, when people are having a hard time, they rush to the thing that they can control. So controlling their eating habits, controlling their exercise, controlling the way they look. And it's so common. Like, you don't have to be a competitive athlete in order to experience that. So how many people can we say, I mean, your clients and my clients and the listeners, like, how many of us can say that, you know, when things haven't been going right, we've rushed to do, like, to control something in our life, you know, just to feel like we don't have to think about those other things. And I relate to your story because I make no secret that I had like a full-blown binge eating disorder in my early 20s, and it kind of petered out towards the end of my 20s. And again, I looking when I kind of self-analyze, it was definitely triggered by a breakup when I was a teenager. And like you just said, suddenly I was just like, I want to look my best. Like, I want to look amazing, just to kind of shove it in his face. And that was what triggered it. So then I started exercising like a maniac, and then I started dieting and eating way below my caloric needs. And it just triggered this binge eating disorder that went on for years. And it's just really, I think when it comes to making healthy changes in your life, you should really pick one thing that you want to focus on rather than diving in like head first into everything, and just work on one thing. Like, for example, you know, work on your fitness and just work on that. Like, just take your time with it. Don't put too much pressure on yourself. And then when you're ready to work on your food, then work on your food. I think it's there's something to be said for, you know, taking things slow, taking things at an easy pace. And you know, the industry that we come from, it's like, it's not about that. It's like, just go straight in there, you know, with both feet, you know, train hard, eat as well as you can. But it's a really interesting story. And I think, you know, the fact that you've learned that you don't want to put women through what you went through, I think that's a really powerful thing. Like the fact that you actually came to terms with that, and you're like, you know, I'm going to do the right thing here, because you just don't want to put them through that same thing. So when you look at women competing now, how do you feel about that? Would you advise them against it, or would you say, oh, each to their own, like go for it?
Everyone's different, you know, like there are people who, I mean, I don't have anything, I don't hate on bodybuilding at all. And like I said,
not,
when
yeah.
I first got into it, it was enjoyable. I was doing it for the right reasons. And it was, you know, it was an enjoyable experience that added to my life rather than taken away from it. But bodybuilding doesn't come without consequences. And so there's nothing wrong with the sport inherently. It's just that there are a lot of people getting into it for the wrong reasons, or not fully knowing what they're getting themselves into. So if someone's thinking about competing, they need to really carefully consider, okay, do I know what this is really going to consist of? Do I know the potential consequences? Am I willing to accept that? Is it really in line with my core values? Because everyone has a different set of core values. And if someone really values their health, for example, then competing is going to compromise that core value of health. And it's about asking yourself, am I willing to compromise that for the sport? Do I really know what extent I'm pushing myself to? Do I know that I could sacrifice my fertility, my menstrual cycle function, my bone health? Do I know that I could experience issues with my body image, relationship with food, with my digestion? Am I willing to accept that? Am I willing to push my body through that, knowing what I'm getting myself into?
Yeah.
And also questioning, like I mentioned, you know, am I doing this as a coping mechanism? If so, is that really smart? Am I doing it just because it looks glamorous on social media and I think it's going to get me likes and interaction? If so, is that really a good idea? Or is that going to lead to further issues from a body image and relationship with food perspective, which it may well do? So it's about knowing what you're getting yourself into, assessing your own personal core values, and making sure that your decision to get into the sport does not compromise those core values. And if it does, it's probably not the sport for you. And just really getting curious on why you want to get into the sport.
And what I love what you're all about, you're basically all about helping women achieve the body of their dreams without any negative health consequences. And after what you've just been saying as well, without any mental health issues, or, you know, without them getting stuck into something that they don't understand fully. So that's what I love that you're all about. And it's obviously based on your experience from before. So that's a really great thing. So, I mean, what we decided before we came onto this podcast was a specific health issue that you've possibly come across many times before, and that is the female menstrual cycle. So that's something that I want to dive into a bit more, because you know, the female form is just absolutely incredible. It's so intelligent. It reads your inner environment, it reads your outer environment, and it's scanning, and it's like, okay, is this environment suitable to have a child? Can I do this? And basically that's what the menstrual cycle is all about. It's all about kind of, you know, preparing for that event. So if anything is off track in your environment, then obviously your menstrual cycle kind of responds, and it might become very irregular, it might shut down. And so what is the prevalence of that? How much have you seen that around in your kind of area of work?
Yeah, a lot. So especially within bodybuilding, most women will have to sacrifice menstrual cycle function in order to reach stage condition. And that's something that people don't often realize. And they also don't often realize that the consequences of that go far beyond fertility. It can lead to issues with heart health, with bone health, with incontinence, and these things can have a significant negative impact on your life, your quality of life, your lifespan, and your function on an everyday basis. There are obviously some underlying causes for irregularities and an absence of a regular menstrual cycle, such as polycystic ovaries. So if you have any concerns, it's really important that we get checked for those things first. But what it's called when we don't have regular menstrual cycles is amenorrhea, hypothalamic amenorrhea. And how that occurs is it usually occurs as a combination of psychological and or physical stress and low energy availability. So low energy availability is, it's basically, our energy availability is the amount of energy we have left after our activity levels, our training for bodily functions and reproductive function. And when we have limited any energy available after our expenditure through our activity, through our training, etc., what our body will do is it will sacrifice our menstrual cycle function in order to keep our other bodily functions going and keep us alive. But with that sacrifice of our menstrual cycle function and impaired hormone health comes other consequences. And what will usually accompany the absence of menstrual cycle function is low estrogen. So if we think about the symptoms that women experience when they're going through the menopause, a lot of those are replicated with women who have amenorrhea, so women who don't have regular cycles. They will be at risk of incontinence. They might feel cold all the time. They, like I said, they might have issues with bone health, such as osteoporosis as they age. These symptoms can be really serious.
Mood issues,
they can
big
be
one,
life-changing. And people don't realize that. People just think, oh, well, it's okay if I've lost my period because I don't want kids. But it's not just about that. Like, the issues go far beyond that. And it's so important to bring awareness to that. And like I said, it's very common for women to have to sacrifice menstrual cycle function in order to get stage lean. And that's one of the reasons our stage condition is not maintainable. And it's not something that women who don't compete should be striving for. We need to remember that bodybuilders, they diet down to stage condition and they maintain that for one day, and then they regain the necessary body fat for health. So for people that want to reach a body composition where they're happy and maintain that year round, a stage lean physique should not be their goal, because that is something that bodybuilders only maintain for one single day, and then they reverse that process and they regain body fat.
And that's the thing, the social media is so misleading, because all of the fitness professionals, like, they post their best photos of when they were super lean, but the truth is, during the year, they're kind of in and out of that. They're probably, they're in bulking phases, and they're a bit bigger than they are in some of their photos. And so that's why it's so important that people know that that's not it's not a state that you should be in like 100% of the time. But can I just ask a personal question? Did you find that you had amenorrhea during your competing years?
Yeah, I did. Every single time I prepped, I lost my cycle. And like I said, it's common. Most female competitors will find that they have to sacrifice menstrual cycle function in order to get stage lean. And I am definitely one of those people. Like, I always lost my cycle quite early on in a prep. So again, that was one of the reasons I decided to step back from bodybuilding, because I did value my health and I didn't want to put my body what it was going through anymore. I didn't want to sacrifice my hormone health anymore. And it just isn't something that I'm willing to do.
And at what body fat percentage does it usually drop off?
It's different for everybody. Like,
Right.
everybody is different. Some people will find that they can, there is the odd person who can go through a contest prep and retain menstrual cycle function.
Wow.
And for them, like, great. But for other people, they're much more sensitive to stress, psychological or physical stress, and they will lose their period much more easily. And I'm one of those people. So there's no one size fits all with it. It's just about monitoring your body and getting in tune with that, and having an awareness of, okay, when do I start to experience the negative effects of dieting, and how can I make sure that I don't push past that? And how can I make sure that I am acting in line with my values? If I value my health, that I'm not compromising that. And weighing up as well, like, getting lean, for each individual, it will come with a different amount of risk. And it's about weighing up, is that risk worth it for that condition? Like, what is that condition really offering me?
Yeah. How long does it take to come back to come back to a regular cycle? Does it ever come back to being regular?
It does come back to being regular for most people, yes. There's
Good.
no
That's
guarantees.
reassuring. Yeah.
But there's no one size fits all. It takes me months to regain my cycle after I've lost it, usually. And I do find that, from observation of others in the fitness industry, women that I've helped, for example, it can take a different amount of time to regain their cycle, depending on how long they've been in a deficit, how long they've been without it, how far they've pushed their body, how extreme the dieting phase has been. If they've got any other underlying conditions such as polycystic ovaries, that can affect things. But everyone is different. For me, like I said, especially considering when I did prep, I did quite long preps. And so it took me a good, I'd say, at least 3 months to regain my cycle. But everyone's different, and it also depends on how the post-diet phase has gone. For example, if someone has tried to do a really slow reverse diet and they've prolonged the amount of time they've spent in a deficit, then it's probably going to take them longer to regain their cycle, in comparison to someone who comes straight back up to maintenance after fat loss and starts the work that they need to do on their health straight away.
Right. And I really can't wait to get to the maintenance stuff, because I think that's really, really important. But just kind of hovering over the menstrual cycle. Do you know what? It's not just competing. It's women who are stressed in life. Like you said, it's about mental stress as well. And mums who can't get any sleep, and they've got to work, and they have kids, and like I said, people diving into their fitness regime and dieting really hard. And I think we're all at risk of that, of having menstrual cycle irregularities. I mean, for me, I do you know what, my menstrual cycle hasn't been regular for a really long time, and I actually can't trace back to when it started. It's been that long. But what I do know is, when I was trying to conceive my second child, he's 1 now, so it was a couple of years ago when I started trying to conceive. At that time, I was dieting pretty hard, and I was training hard, and I was like, I don't know why I'm not conceiving. Like, and I'm a nutritionist, I'm a fitness professional, like, and you can't see clearly yourself, you can't see yourself clearly. So I was just like, but I'm doing everything right, like I feel great, and I just could not see what was right in front of me. And it's only when I went to a dietitian and to my doctor to figure out what's going on, I was like, okay, so I don't know what the problem is. And they were just like, well, look at you. I was very skinny at the time. And they were like, what's your diet like? What's your lifestyle like? And I was like, I told them, and they were just like, it's really obvious what the issue is. And I was like, oh my God, like, I felt so foolish, because, I'm meant to know this stuff. Like, I'm meant to know it. But when it comes to myself, like, aren't we just the harshest critics on ourselves, and we just can't see ourselves clearly? So literally, like, I just put on a few kilos, and I just toned everything down. I wasn't dieting as hard, and then I conceived literally within a couple of months. So it's absolutely amazing how it can happen to everybody. So,
Yeah.
I mean, your clients, what sort of clients are you dealing with? Not so much bodybuilders anymore, but more women who want to look really amazing. Do you find that they experience menstrual cycle issues as well?
So I tend to work with two different groups of people. I work with people who are coming out of the back of extreme dieting. So people who maybe competed in the past, but they now want to recover from that from a health perspective and improve their body image, relationship with food, menstrual cycle functions. They're the type of people who are working to regain their menstrual cycle after pushing their bodies to the extreme. So I'll help those group of people like regain their cycles. And then the other group of people that I work with are people that are trying to progress towards their goals whilst improving their health and quality of life and not sacrificing it. And I coach quite a few personal trainers and coaches. And then I also coach just people in the general population as well. The people who are just trying to strive towards, improving their overall health and quality of life and reach their body composition and training performance related goals, they don't tend to experience menstrual cycle function problems. They don't tend to suffer with amenorrhea because I make sure that I don't push them to that extreme. It's not necessary for anyone who doesn't want to step on stage, for example, for them to be losing their cycle. And if I ever found that their cycle became irregular, then I would make sure that we pull back on the things that we need to pull back on, such as training intensity. I'd make sure that they're out of a calorie deficit in order to correct any red flags that we've seen straight away, rather than continuing to push them through a dieting phase, for example, when they're seeing those negative health consequences.
So if somebody is listening to this and they're training hard and they're eating as well as they can, what is an irregular cycle? How can they figure out if, oh God, maybe mine needs to be looked at, maybe my regime is too difficult? What should they be looking out for? Like, what is an irregular cycle?
So what I will say is everyone's cycle length is different. Like there's no one size fits all. The standard 28-day example, not everyone's cycle is 28 days. So it's not necessarily a cause for concern if you have a slightly longer cycle or a slightly shorter cycle. It's about figuring out what your normal is and then making sure that your cycle is not too far outside of that. So the first thing I'd recommend someone do, everyone who's listening to this podcast who is a woman, it will do you good to track your cycle. Like that is the first place to start. Like just track it. Just track when you come on, like when you start your bleed, when you end your bleed, any PMS symptoms that you're experiencing alongside that. That is the first place to start. And from that information, you will be able to establish what a standard cycle looks like for you. So for example, if you find that it's 30 days, you've got your 30-day cycle. Anything around sort of 5 days within that either way I wouldn't say is a cause for concern. So say your normal cycle is 30 days, but one month you come on day 27, that's not a cause for concern. But if you start to see, like I said, if your cycle is outside of sort of 5 days of that ish, say you start to come on day 35 and then the next cycle is a bit longer than that and then the next cycle is a bit longer, that's where it's probably a bit of a pink flag. So it's something you need to be aware of. And if you experience those irregularities, so if you came on sort of like beyond 5 days out of your normal range, then what I would personally advise doing is making sure that you're covering all bases in terms of removing as much psychological and physical stress as possible, working on stress management tools, prioritizing sleep, making sure that you're out of a calorie deficit so you've got enough fuel coming in to support your activity levels, and make sure that you're not training to failure. And then, monitor that cycle moving forwards. If it starts to get more regular again, you've corrected things, brilliant, carry on. If it doesn't, then implement more changes, remove more stress, potentially reduce training frequency even further, that sort of thing.
Yeah. And it's great that you pay attention to everything in someone's lifestyle. So it's not just pulling back on exercise, looking at the diet, but it's also like your mental, your emotional stress and your sleep. Like sleep is so freaking important. Like it's up there with when it comes to body composition and looking your best. Sleep is up there with exercise and with food, and it's not a sexy topic. It's not something people want to talk about. It's not something people really pay attention to. But the point is, if you're not getting enough sleep, then it doesn't matter if you have the perfect program, you have the perfect nutrition, diet, you're not going to achieve what you want to achieve because you're not sleeping. I mean, I used to spend a lot of time around bodybuilders as well. I think it's just a rite of passage when you work in a gym, the free weights area, like that's where you find them. And God, it was all about sleep. It's like because that's when your muscles recover, that's when they grow, that's when they become strong. And if you want to have that toned physique, then sleep is really, really important for that. And, recovery, and it's just so key. And I remember the bodybuilders were like napping like during the day. They were making sure they were getting their daily naps. And if they missed it, it was like the worst thing ever. So it really is like it's like a different routine. It's like a different lifestyle, isn't it? But there's something in it because it's an art, like growing your muscles and losing body fat. Like it's an absolute art that you have to master. And I can understand why it takes over people's lives, but there's really good tips that everyone can take from that. And I think sleep is definitely one of them, basically.
Yeah. What I will say is you don't need to be napping every day. Like, don't worry if you're listening to this podcast. There are not many people that can nap in the day. I definitely don't nap in the day, for
Did
one.
you nap when you were competing?
And I'm sure that, what did you say?
Did you nap when you were competing?
Do you know what? I the time in my life where I did nap was when I was a one-to-one personal trainer. And the reason for that was that
early
I was
mornings,
like 4 a.m. and I was getting home from work at like 10. So it was my time to like literally catch up on sleep that I was deprived of through the night. But when I was bodybuilding, I didn't tend to nap just because like it just never really worked for me, and I'm quite busy through the day. So like it's not realistic for most people to nap. You don't need to nap to make progress, so don't worry about that.
So how many hours sleep do you recommend?
Again, everyone's different. Like some people will get 5 hours sleep and they'll be sound. They'll feel fresh as daisy. They'll wake up feeling refreshed and they'll have no problems. Whereas other people will need at least 8. Everyone's different. And again, it's about listening to your body and how it responds. So if you're waking up feeling pretty refreshed in the morning, your energy levels don't crash through the day, then you're sound, you're getting enough sleep.
Yeah.
What is relatively important is that you're pretty consistent with your sleep routine. So where possible, you're maintaining a consistent bedtime and wake time, because that will help regulate something called your circadian rhythm, which is like your sleep rhythm, basically. It's like your sleep cycle. So yeah, consistency is the most important thing, and finding out what works for you. If you feel refreshed, then sound. If you don't feel refreshed, listen to your body and try and get a little bit more sleep.
Okay. So that's great. I'm going to make sure I do that. But to be honest, I think I get too much sleep. Like I go to bed very early and I kind of wake up at 6:30, which I think is a decent time, but I go to bed at 8 o'clock. But I have just had a child and I'm a bit traumatized from not having enough sleep when he was younger. So I think I'm just overcoming that. But anyway, that's a separate story. So you say that you help women come out of hard training and come out of the the bodybuilding that they were doing and the competitions, but this goes for everybody. So maintenance, like being in a maintenance phase of your program, is, again, it's a skill, it's an art, and it's something that needs to be mastered, like mentally, emotionally, physically. So I guess when anybody reaches their goal, because once you reach your goal and you're kind of like at the top of your game, like you were when you were doing your competing, that's the easy part. Like, I mean, not saying that it was easy for you, but getting to the top is one thing, but then maintaining it and staying mentally sound and staying fit and healthy and maintaining a level of health that you're happy with, that's a skill. So, I mean, how does that work in what you do? Like, how do you help women maintain themselves once they've achieved what they wanted to achieve?
Yeah. Now, the first thing I think it's important to touch on is that when you compete, you are not healthy. So the goal is not to maintain that.
Yeah.
The goal is to regain the necessary body fat for health and restore health. So we're not trying to jump straight to maintenance from when we've competed, from when we've ended an extreme diet. We do need to move into a surplus after that in order to restore health, in order to restore menstrual cycle function, etc.
And how long does that take usually to get someone back to a maintenance phase?
Everyone is different.
Okay,
it all depends on like largely how long it takes to regain the menstrual cycle. The amount of body fat that will take will differ between individuals as well. It will depend on how long it takes to improve someone's relationship with food, like how badly they were struggling, all of those sorts of things. So someone coming out of an extreme diet is a bit of a different kettle of fish. Like it will depend, and we don't want to go straight to maintenance because they're not healthy. When you step on stage, you are the opposite of health.
Yeah, you don't want to be keeping that after you've stepped off the stage. Yeah.
You're literally the opposite of health when you step on stage. So you need to restore health in that scenario. But if someone had just done, say they'd done like a moderate fat loss phase, they were a lifestyle client, they'd not sacrificed their health, they still had a regular menstrual cycle, relationship with food is intact, body image was intact, then that individual could go straight to maintenance. And that's an important point in itself, because a lot of people will end a fat loss phase and they'll try to do a like really slow reverse diet from the calories that they were on at the end of the diet. And if they do that, they're just prolonging the deficit that they're in, and they're prolonging that restoration of their energy levels, of their strength, of, more flexibility when it comes to nutrition. So at the end of a diet phase, if health is kept intact, we want to come straight up to maintenance, and that will usually look like a bump of a few hundred calories and a slight reduction in cardio, and then we can monitor how someone responds and adapt where necessary from there. And obviously taper food up and taper expenditure down until they get to a point where they're around maintenance within a certain range. But again, a really important point to make is that maintenance is not a fixed state. It's a sliding scale. And whilst we're at maintenance, we're still going to see fluctuations in water retention, inflammation, muscle fullness. We have things like our menstrual cycle, which impact how we feel and impact how we respond. And it's not a fixed state. We can't control everything. There are variables that we're never going to have full control over, and it's really important to be accepting of the natural fluctuations in our bodies that will occur throughout our lives. And once we accept those natural fluctuations, it's so freeing, and it will result in huge improvements from a body image, relationship with food, and overall health perspective.
Can you explain, you were talking about fat loss phase and then reverse dieting and then maintenance. So for people who don't really understand what that means, so when someone wants to lose fat, how do they do that? And then why do they need to reverse diet? Like, what's this all about?
Yeah, so basically how we achieve fat loss is by expending more energy than we're taking in. So we create something called a calorie deficit. And we do that by either reducing calories, so reducing the amount of food we're consuming, or increasing our activity levels or cardio, or a combination of the two. Usually people will choose a combination of the two because it means that, if you were to only reduce food, you'd have to have quite a big drop in food. If you were to only increase activity levels, it would require quite a big increase in activity levels. Whereas if we use a combination of the two, it's like a nice happy middle ground where you can maybe introduce a little bit of cardio, you can just pull food down a touch and you'll lose a bit of body fat. So we lose body fat when we're expending more energy than we're taking in. And as we become a smaller human, so as we actually lose body fat, we then might find we need to push things a little bit harder. So we might need to decrease food a little bit more, or increase expenditure a little bit more, increase our activity levels a bit more, because we require less energy to sustain our bodies when we are smaller. So that's why, one of the reasons why we'll have to make adaptations throughout our fat loss phase and decrease food a little bit further at some points. And then once someone has achieved their goal, they can then come up to maintenance.
And I just ask really quickly, how long is a safe fat loss phase? Like, how long can you be in that safely?
Everyone's different. It's completely individual, and it also depends on how aggressive you're being, because some people will prefer to do more of an aggressive fat loss phase for a shorter period of time. Other people will prefer to do a less aggressive fat loss phase for a longer period of time. Both of those are viable options. It just depends on the person's preferences and the person's ability to tolerate things like hunger, for example. So yeah, everyone's different, and I would always take a person-centered approach with what I decide to do with a client. So it will depend on their preferences, their health, their relationship with food, and also how they respond, and we will make any necessary adjustments throughout the process. But yeah, everyone is completely different. It will also depend on how much body fat they're carrying to start with. If someone's carrying a lot of body fat, then they might have to do a slightly longer fat loss phase, whereas if someone's not carrying much body fat at all, they definitely don't need to be in a fat loss phase for long.
So I mean, so I know there's a huge range then, depending on all of those variables you just mentioned, but are we talking weeks or months? Like, or it literally just depends. Like, it could be weeks for someone who just wants to do a little bit, or like months for someone who
completely depends. You know, you might get someone who is relatively lean already and just wants to lose a tiny bit of body fat so that they feel a little bit leaner for their wedding, and that person, you know, they might just do a 6-week fat loss phase and be sound. Whereas there might be someone who's significantly overweight and needs to lose body fat for their health, and they might have to lose several stone, and that's not going to come off overnight. So that could be months. And it also depends on life circumstances. You know, if something comes up in life and someone has a really challenging period of time, which means that they can't quite adhere to their targets as they might usually be able to, and therefore it's more appropriate to remove the stress of fat loss and spend a period of time at maintenance to break that up. They might have to pursue fat loss for longer, but that's okay, because life happens, and that's, you know, it's the nature of life.
And so if you're competing, then something called a reverse diet is necessary, because you don't want to go from fat loss then straight into maintenance. But for your everyday lady, going straight into maintenance after her fat loss phase is advisable and is safe. So what would a maintenance phase then look like? Is that just meeting your caloric requirements? How does that work?
Yeah, so again, just to touch on that briefly, even competitors, they don't want to remain in a deficit. They want to go straight into a calorie surplus rather than a reverse diet. So they actually want to get into a surplus so that they're able to regain body fat for health, whereas the average person can come up to maintenance rather than going into a surplus, if that makes sense.
Yeah, gotcha. So when does reverse dieting come into it?
It's kind of not necessary. Like, what we tend to promote now is something called a recovery diet, which is where someone comes straight up to maintenance and then into a surplus as quickly as possible. The people used to call a quote unquote reverse diet, where you would say you finish a fat loss phase on 1,500 calories. What they would do, and this is what people in the past would call a reverse diet, is they'd slowly trickle calories up and they'd remain in a deficit to try and stay as lean as possible. It's not necessary, and it's prolonging the negative effects from a health perspective that come with extreme dieting. So that's why we want to avoid taking that approach. The only circumstance I would consider that potentially with somebody is if psychologically they were really struggling with dealing with the increase in food, in which case you might take a slightly more gradual approach to getting to maintenance. But again, everybody is different.
Okay. So maintenance. So with that, what would that look like?
So again, energy balance is like calories in versus calories out, and maintenance is where roughly we are expending the same amount of energy as we're taking in. This looks different for everybody again. Everyone's activity levels are different. Everyone's, heights are different, muscle mass, body mass. And so we all have different energy requirements for numerous reasons.
Okay.
I think it's also really important to recognize that our energy requirements will fluctuate on a daily basis. So there might be one day where I fidget more, I have to run more errands, I train on that day. And that day, my energy requirements are going to be higher than a day where I am chilling on the sofa on a Sunday watching TV. And so it's really important to recognize that, and it gives you peace of mind, because if, for example, one day you consume a little bit more food, it's not worth stressing over, because your energy expenditure is going to fluctuate on a daily basis anyway. And so it's okay if your energy intake fluctuates in line with that. And recognizing that can give you peace of mind, and it can help you really relax around nutrition and not stress about micromanaging everything so much.
And so what's your preferred method of measuring that? So how does someone know that they're staying in maintenance and they're not kind of losing where they were? What's your preferred methods of measuring that?
Yeah, so it's mainly, there are calculators people can use online if they want to. There's the Harris-Benedict equation, for example, and you can use that as a rough estimate, but it's only ever a rough estimate. And then from there, what you might do is, and this is if someone was just, they just wanted to go straight into maintenance, they could use that as a rough idea, set their targets, use those calorie equations to figure out a calorie target, and then literally follow those targets and monitor how they respond. Right. If they start to gain body fat, then reduce calories a little bit. If they lose body fat and they're getting leaner, increase food or decrease expenditure. It's all about monitoring how an individual responds and then adjusting where necessary. And someone's targets might change throughout their lives anyway, as they change, as they go through different life seasons, as their activity levels change, their training changes. So there's no, it's not like, oh, here's your 2,000 calories, you're going to stick at that forever. It's like, okay, let's set these targets, let's see how you respond and adjust where necessary. And we will have to adjust over time, because life is not, stagnant. So yeah, it's really, really important to recognize that. The other approach is, obviously, if someone does finish a fat loss phase, you might try a bit of a moderate increase of a few hundred calories, bring down expenditure a touch, again, see how they respond and adjust where necessary, as a bit more of like a steady approach to that, just to ease them into maintenance rather than going straight into a big jump. So that's always an option. But again, everyone's different, and it will depend on someone's personality type, the approach that I take with someone as well. Because some people, they don't mind big jumps after being in the fat loss phase, whereas other people will be a bit more conservative and worried about the process. And another thing I will say is, not all of my clients track their calories and macros. Some clients I work using habit-based targets instead, feedback from food diaries and the hunger scale. And you don't have to track your food in order to make progress. And you don't have to track your food in order to stay at maintenance either.
So from maintenance, I suppose they can stay in maintenance, or they can go for another fat loss phase, and you can just kind of take it from there. So maintenance is like a baseline, basically, for somebody.
Yeah, it's such an important tool to master, because if you think about it, most people in the general population, they want to achieve a body composition that they're happy with. They want to be healthy, they want to feel good, they want to perform well, and they want to maintain that year round and enjoy their lives. They don't want to be in constant cycles of bulking and cutting, for example. Yeah. So they need to master maintenance if they wish to obtain that body composition that they're happy with in good health and maintain that. It's where a lot of people go wrong, because they'll run a fat loss phase and then they'll be like, oh, I've achieved my goal now, don't know what to do, but I'm going to leave my coach away. Yeah. And then they end up back where they started, or not knowing what to do, and it can be very confusing. Whereas if you learn to master maintenance, you go through a maintenance phase with your coach after you've achieved your goal of fat loss, you're set. Because once you're at maintenance, it's much easier. Once you've mastered it, it's hard to master, but once you've mastered it, it's such a brilliant phase because you have a lot of flexibility from a nutrition perspective. You can include lots of variety in your diet. You know, you can eat out pretty easily. You can cook meals by yourself or with your partner or with your kids pretty easily. It's just important that you maintain the consistency with training regularly and staying active alongside that.
And it's such an important point, because when you do anything amazing, like just say you complete your degree, or you complete, some sort of education, or you have a baby, or, so much attention is on the actual event. But then when it's done, people are kind of lost. They're like, okay, I've done all that, so what do I do now? And there's not as much guidance on that part. So the fact that you're stepping in to fill that niche, like to fill that hole for people, you're just like, look, I know exactly what to do with you right now. You've only just started, here we go. And you take them on this journey. I think that's so unique. So I guess I've got some kind of more quick fire questions for you now, because I'm very aware of time. How are you with time, by the way?
Yeah, fine, honestly.
Okay, perfect. How does someone stay freaking motivated? Because, I had this question not long ago from one of my clients. She's like, what the hell? Like, she's like, I have all the information I could ever need. I've got all the support I could ever need. Why can't I just eat well? Like, why can't I just train? Like, why can't I just do it? So how do you stay motivated, and how would you recommend other people to stay motivated? Like, what's the secret?
So I don't rely on motivation, and I don't think most people should. It's something that is fleeting. It's something that will fluctuate throughout our lives for numerous reasons.
I like that.
So what I recommend doing instead of relying on motivation is identifying what your core values are, identifying how you can act in line with them on a daily basis, and applying discipline when it comes to the occasions where you don't feel like doing the things that you know you need to do for your greater good the majority of the time. And recognize that, no one feels motivated 100% of the time. It's an unrealistic expectation. And if we expect that, we're setting ourselves up for failure, and we're going to beat ourselves up when we don't feel the way that we expect ourselves to feel. So it's important to recognize that motivation is fleeting. It's going to come in waves, and it's about creating routine and structure so that you can show up for yourself regardless of where your motivation is at.
Right. Because I suppose a big red flag is if you're always pushing yourself to do something. Oh, I've got to go to the gym again, and I've got to go again. And there's only so many times that you can actually do that before you're like, I can't do this anymore. And you just kind of burn out. So finding that's kind of your red flag. And that's when it's time to kind of change your mindset and be like, okay, so why am I doing this? And like you said, go back to the core values and figure out what your, real reasons for doing this are, because, go on.
Potentially your red flag to reassess what you're doing. Like, do you really care about the goal that you're trying to achieve? Does the goal need changing? Or does your routine need changing? Are you setting unrealistic expectations? Like, do you need to be training 5 times a week, or could you pull it back to 4 or 3 for a period of time? Is that better suited to your lifestyle potentially?
And that brings me on to my next question, which is, what is the minimum that we should all be doing if we want to be building healthy, strong muscles for longevity, for, health, for tone? What would you recommend?
So the minimum I'd say is 2 sessions a week, like the absolute minimum. And if you were training twice a week, you're best to do just full body sessions, because then you're hitting each muscle group at least twice a week. So I'd say that's the minimum for supporting health. Ideally for most people, if they can get at least 3 sessions in a week, that would be fantastic. And then anything beyond that is just a bit of a bonus, really.
I think that's doable. I think people can do that. And you recommend full body workouts, so upper body, lower body. If you're doing just twice a week, maybe 3 times a week, just kind of hit all the big muscle groups. What are your kind of favorite go-to exercises? Just say you're low on time and you're just like, I just need to get my workout done, need to leave. what are your main exercises that you're like, I have to do this one, I have to include this?
Yeah. So if you're really short on time, again, like full body is probably, if you're training 3 or less times a week, full body is probably the best, going to give you the most bang for your buck. So it's probably going to produce the most results. If you're training more than 3 times a week, then you could then split your sessions into like lower body, upper body, or something like pull, push, legs, specialization, whatever. But 3 times less, stick with full body sessions. And if you're doing a full body session, to cover all bases, what I would do is I would pick a squat pattern, a hip hinge, such as a deadlift, for example. I would pick an upper body push, an upper body pull, and something like a hip thrust for most women as well.
Like a
something
bench press and like a row for upper body push, upper body pull.
Yeah. So an upper body push would be any like shoulder press, bench press, anything like that. Upper body pull would be a row, a lat pull down. Ideally, across the week, you would want both a horizontal and vertical push and pull. So both like a row and a lat pull down, both a shoulder press and a bench press, for example, across the week. But if you're going in, you've got one session, you're really short on time, just do like a squat pattern, a hip hinge, an upper body push, an upper body pull. You're pretty much covering all bases across your full body. Yeah. And then anything on top of that is a bonus.
And I suppose the more sessions you do in the week, then you can start to isolate a bit more, right? That's when you can bring in the bicep curls and the leg extensions and things like that. That's when you can really hone in on each muscle rather than training big muscle groups. Yeah, I really like that. I have quite a funny question. Last time I asked this to someone, they were like, well, I'm not too okay, so just say somebody wanted the best abs that they could get. This is probably a really big answer, which obviously you don't have to give, but if someone wanted great abs, what would you recommend?
Right, so our abdominal muscles, they're obviously a muscle group. So like any other muscle group, if we train them, they are going to become more developed. So we can train our abs and we can build more muscle tissue in that area, and it will probably help with the development we're able to see. However, for most people, they will have to pursue fat loss in order for those abdominal muscles to become visible. And for a lot of people, depending on how lean they sit naturally, it might not be worth the trade-off to have abs, because a lot of women, for example, will have to diet to the point of losing their periods or experiencing menstrual cycle irregularities to really obtain visible abs. So it's like, okay, like, is that really worth it? Other people, they might have to completely, be really rigid from a nutrition perspective. They might have to sacrifice an element of their social lives. And again, that might not be worth it for them. So it's about weighing up the pros and cons. Like, is it really worth it? Do I really care about seeing my abs? Because for the majority of people, it's probably not worth it.
Yeah, no, that's really good. Just say they wanted to build up their abs. What are some exercises that you enjoy doing yourself?
So to be honest, I do a bit of abdominal training, but it's more for stability and injury prevention and function. It's not to build my abdominal muscles. Yes. So the exercises I personally do, I wouldn't necessarily recommend them to people who want visible abs. Like, I do them for function and for stability and for strength. And that carries over to the rest of my training. So I'll do things like a Turkish sit up, which, if anyone's heard of a Turkish get up, it's like the first part of that, where you sit up with the kettlebell. I'll do things like walkouts. I have some plank variations in my program at the moment, but again, it's more from a function perspective. Whereas I'd probably recommend, and I'll program for clients, again, exercises that are going to help with stability and with, if they, for example, compete in a sport or they're trying to improve their performance in a particular area, I'll include core exercises that will help their performance in that area. So I have some clients who do pole dancing, and I'll include core work to help supplement their pole performance, as opposed to being like, here's some ab work so you can build your abs, if that makes sense. So things like torso rotations with a cable, that can be quite good, especially for people who need that rotational work. You can include a mixture of different exercises. So I would include some isometric holds, but then also some exercises where you're doing like a crunch style motion. But yeah, it depends on the goal. But I'd definitely say if you're wanting to see visible abs, you're probably best going about that through pursuing fat loss as opposed to just adding in more ab exercises.
Yeah. And I'm in total agreement with everything you just said. And it's basically what I would say as well. But the reason why I ask is because it's such a trend to go into a class in a gym, like 30 minutes abs, you know, and there's like 30-minute ab classes on Instagram, and it's just such a thing. And it's like, I guess the point is that yes, you can do them if you enjoy it, but if you really want abs, then like you said, you're probably better off pursuing a fat loss phase rather than, you know, working on those exercises, you know, doing 100 sit-ups a day, that sort of thing. Okay, so I have one more question. Supplements. Do you take any? Do you recommend any?
So I personally take vitamin D. I take a fish oil, and I'm trying to think. I take creatine monohydrate and inositol. I take inositol because I have PCOS. So that is not a supplement that I would recommend for everybody. Those who have PCOS, potentially inositol is something that I would consider. But if you haven't, don't worry about that. Vitamin D3 is something that I would recommend for those of us who don't get a lot of daylight exposure. Those of us in the UK, most of us need to be taking vitamin D because we just don't get enough from the sun. So yeah, that's one that I do recommend to most clients, unless they're like in a really sunny country and they're getting loads of daylight exposure, in which case they might not need it. Most of us don't consume enough oily fish in our diet, which is why I take a fish oil. I'll not take it if I have a week where I have consumed a lot of oily fish, such as salmon, then I won't take it, but I'll take it the majority of the time. And creatine monohydrate is one of the most research-backed supplements out there. It has benefits when it comes to our cognitive performance as well as our physical performance, as it's involved in energy production. And people always ask, like, do I need to load creatine monohydrate? No, you don't. You just need to take 5 grams per day every day.
Even days you're not training? Even days you're not training?
I was just going to say that as well. Yeah.
Yes.
People are always like, oh, should I take it
I
on a
actually want to
rest
know that. Yeah.
Yeah, you should take it on a rest day as well as a training day, because we're trying to keep our creatine stores saturated. And to keep them saturated, we want to be taking them every day. It doesn't make a difference whether you're training or resting.
Okay, because at the moment I train about 4 to 5 times a week, and I only take the creatine when I work out. Like after I work out, I'll take the creatine. And I was like, in my days off, I'm like, should I be taking the creatine right now? I'm just like, no, don't waste it. Just keep it. But that's good to know. So I'll start taking it on my days off as well. That's good. I take all of those that you just mentioned, and I also take magnesium, which you know is a big one as well, because our food supply is so low in it, and you know it's really good for sleep and lowering stress. Yeah.
I sometimes take a supplement called Support Max Neuro PM, which I don't know if you've heard of, but that contains magnesium and ashwagandha in it as well. But yeah, I don't always recommend that to everybody, but it's a supplement that I really enjoy. And I notice it has an impact on my sleep. Like if I don't take that supplement, which contains those 2 things, I do notice that my sleep quality isn't quite as good. So I do try and stay on top of that as well.
I think they're really good core supplements to recommend. I think they're supplements that are generally considered safe, and most of us need it. So I think they're really nice supplements to recommend. I think that basically wraps up my questions. I've gotten a lot of answers today. Thank you so much. Is there anything else that you think people should know? Is there anything that you want to kind of finish on?
I think that's everything really. Like if anyone does have any questions, please feel free to message me. Like I don't bite. I'm always happy to help. Myself and Charlie have a community called the Flourishing Society. We've got an Instagram page, we've got a free Facebook group. So if anyone does need help with anything that I've been sort of talking about today, like, don't hesitate to give us a follow on there. You'll probably really like the content. And like I said, just DM me. My Instagram is Danni Bosworth. I don't bite. And I'd just say, like, whatever goals you decide to set yourself in the world of fitness, have a think about what your core values are, and if the goal is going to sacrifice your core values, and if so, have a think, okay, is there a way I can go about achieving this goal that doesn't sacrifice that value? For example, if you have a value of connection, of human connection, can you go about fat loss in a way that means you don't sacrifice social occasions because they're important to you, so that you're not sacrificing your core values? Because when we do sacrifice our core values, that's where we often end up self-sabotaging. For example, overeating. If your goal is fat loss, you might be doing that because the way that you're trying to go about fat loss is compromising your core values. So it's always important that we come back to those and use those as a bit of a compass to navigate our lives.
Yeah. That's such good advice. And I worked out my core values. I've had 2 coaches to help me with my core values, and I think there are books on it as well. Like, there are ways to figure out your core values. Do you help your clients figure out the core values, or do you give them it as homework sort of thing?
Yeah, so whenever a client comes to me, they'll fill out an initial Q&A, and it's quite an in-depth Q&A. And one of the questions is, what are your core values? And can you give me an example of how you're going to act in line with them moving forwards? And then we'll come back to them every now and again for reference, and also to reassess them. And yeah, I have a Loom video where I explain how to assess your core values and things like that as well.
So you help them find their core values as well. That's cool. Yeah. Well, thank you. Gosh, that was so good. Thank you so much. That was such an awesome conversation. I really enjoyed it. And I just think it's so educational and so useful things that people can use like straight away. So thank you so much for giving your time. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Anytime.